beautiful people, and welcome to yet another rendition of the About That podcast with me, your host, your favorite geek psychologist, your favorite pop culture enthusiast, your favorite queen of the nerds, Dr. Vanessa Hintz. Now, first and foremost, I'm going to address the elephant in the room, which is that I likely sound more nasally than usual because I am at the tail end of one of the many ailments that we get in the Midwest during the wintertime. So a cold, the flu, COVID, I don't know, one of those things is what I had. And I am, again, at the tail end of it, feeling much, much better. So if I sound weird, that's why. Nonetheless, I was talking to my husband and I was like, should I wait to record until I sound better and less like SpongeBob from that episode when he had the suds? And my husband said, no, you present yourself in your authentic form. And I was like, you know what? You damn right. So this is how I am presenting to you all today, as I am, nasally and all. And so the other reason I didn't want to wait is because I am positively brimming with anticipation for this episode, because I am going to talk about probably one of the first, if not the first, things that I ever geeked out about. One of the first things that I ever knew, like, that's something that I love. This is my jam. This is my genre. These are my people. And I am talking about horror films, scary movies. And I am excited to talk to you all not only about my foray into the horror genre and sort of how I came to love horror movies, scary movies, particularly slasher films. We will get there. But also to talk a little bit about what horror teaches us about difference. As a psychologist, as somebody who works in diversity, equity, and inclusion, I often work with people about how they make sense of things in the world around them. So how do you value things? How do you value yourself? Etc., etc. And I think horror, the genre, generally speaking, scary movies, whatever, scary stories, have taught us. I don't want to say taught us. Let me back up. I think horror movies can exacerbate societal ideals about what is to be feared. It can also teach us how we value or relate to difference. And so we're going to get into all of that. But first, let me take a trip down memory lane, all the way back to the halls of Nanny Lee Frazier Elementary School in Louisville, Kentucky, which is where I remember voluntarily reading my first scary stories. And I'm talking about the collection of scary stories in the book Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark by Alvin Schwartz. And I know there was a second book, More Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. But I distinctly remember it had to be like second or third grade. And I was so excited to check that book out of the library. I read it all, I believe, in one sitting. And it was awesome. It was so awesome. The sort of thrill I got from reading it. Again, why that was an elementary school book, I don't know. But I loved it. And I wanted more scary stories. I also was entirely too young to be watching scary movies, but I was doing it anyway because the 90s were definitely different. The way, we were just left to our own devices a lot of the times, which is no shade. I think that's why I'm a boss, independent woman now. Nonetheless, watching scary movies with my sisters more often than not. And two scary movies I feel like were instrumental into my falling in love with the genre. One was absolutely inappropriate. And that is the ninth movie in the Friday the 13th franchise, Jason Goes to Hell. I watched that movie over and over and over again. I love Jason Voorhees, which I'll get into in much greater detail later on. But that was a movie that I remember we had a VHS tape that had, hopefully y'all remember what a VHS tape is, that you put in a VCR. But we had a VHS tape that had that along with the movie Crybaby on it, and Crybaby with Johnny Depp from 1990 is by far my most favorite movie in the history of movies. So I would literally just watch that VHS all the time. And so Jason Goes to Hell, but also the original made-for-TV It that came out in 1990. That was another movie that I watched so often. And it's so funny because it's different to watch it as an adult, because the things that scared me then, I'm like, ooh, definitely different now. But those were two movies, again, that I watched when I was entirely too young that, again, really cemented my love for the genre. And I would say as I have grown over time in my love for the genre, something that I feel like continues to be appealing to me is the exhilaration that I get from feeling scared in a safe environment. Now, let me reiterate. I'm not the type of person that's going to go to a haunted house. Like, I don't want to be scared in real life. Absolutely not. Being scared when you're watching a movie, though, is something that's very different, because there's like to me, almost like a protective barrier between me and the scary thing. You know, if I'm reading a scary book, I can always close it. You know, those things still linger, but I know that that's a story. I can watch a movie and I know that I'm watching something on a screen, which is very different, again, than being scared in real life. And so for me, that's what I love about horror. And so what I want to do now is talk a little bit about, take us through a very crude, very fast history of American horror films. Now, this again is going to be, this is not a dissertation. This is not something that is going to be scholarly by any way, shape, or form. But I remember watching a documentary called Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue. And so I was very intrigued by the way that they sort of walked through these different eras of horror. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about those different eras beginning in the 1930s and 40s all the way up through today, and sort of how films, horror films that were sort of pivotal at the time, how those were reflective of where we sort of were as a society. And again, I'm talking very specifically about American horror. And so this is going to be very US centric, and that's no shade to any other land, space, globally. Just wanted to sort of put that caveat out before I start. So in the 1930s and the 1940s, a lot of the premier horror films were what we call classic monster movies. So Frankenstein, The Wolfman, Dracula, The Mummy, things like that. And I would say that part of that is because around this time, early on in the 1930s, was when we were sort of coming out of that silent film era and coming into, cinema was coming into its own with sound and all of these different things. And so I feel like a lot of filmmakers at that time wanted to put these classic stories on screen. So we got a lot of that in the early ages of cinema with sound. Special mention from this era is the movie Freaks from 1933, which was essentially about carnival sort of sideshow people, which again I think was a deviation from the other films of the era, which again we're going to talk a little bit about what that means later on. But I think that the fact that in an era where there were so many classic horror films, that movie to this day is still pivotal, for lack of a better word, because of its content, I think is very, very interesting. And so if you want an idea about sort of what it was like, what it was about, any of you who are fans of American Horror Story, I believe season 4 was titled Freak Show. I think that was season 4. But very, very similar, very similar. So that's the 1930s and 40s. Cinema is now, we have sound. We're moving out of the silent movie era, so we're seeing a lot of classic stories that we know have stood the test of time on screen. Moving into the 1950s, we still have monster movies that are sort of pervasive in terms of horror. What we have in addition, though, is now we got monsters with some juice. Radioactive monsters. Godzilla on steroids, like whatever. We have all of these different sort of larger than life monsters. And around that time in the 1950s, there was a lot of threat whether it be real threat or perceived, of nuclear war. And so 1952 was the year that the first atom bomb was tested. And so since that time, the U.S. and Russia were sort of in this nuclear arms race. You remember, you can YouTube the old duck and cover drills that kids went through in school. If there's a nuclear bomb, like duck and cover. And so I would say that was also reflected in the horror films, because again, we not only have just Godzilla, now we got radioactive Godzilla. Again, because there was this sort of societal fear of nuclear war. I will also say Invasion of the Body Snatchers came out in the 50s. And so this idea that a foreign invader, if you will, could come and just take over and mess up everything we have going on. Again, also very reminiscent of the thoughts and ideas, the xenophobia that Americans had and likely still have at that time. And for those of you who are not familiar with the word xenophobia, it's sort of like it's a fear or devaluing of people who are not from this country. And again, we can get into a whole conversation about who is and isn't native to this land, but we're going to save that for a different podcast, okay? Okay, so moving on. The 1960s, that was when we saw the emergence of Alfred Hitchcock. And Alfred Hitchcock brought with him all these psychological thrillers and just a whole bunch of things that nobody ever would have thought about with regard to horror. So classic, still to this day, stood the test of time, is the movie Psycho. I know they try to do some remakes, and I just don't know. The show, Bates Motel, was not bad. But the remakes of the movie they made, they need to just stop it. But anyways, Alfred Hitchcock sort of ruled horror, American horror, in the 60s. And in addition to Hitchcock and movies like Psycho, we also saw movies that were more gruesome than we had probably seen before. More gore, more nastiness. I'm thinking of Night of the Living Dead, Blood Feast, Carnival of Souls. Films like that where they were like, all right, we're going to push the limit. And again, think about what was going on in the 1960s. We still have so many people sort of fighting for equal rights and civil rights. This is sort of the era of the free love movement. Like everybody just out here living their best life. I believe Woodstock happened during the 1960s. And so thinking about the sort of vibe that was happening at the time. So you had this sort of counterculture movement along with the sort of dominant cultural movement. And so again, we see a lot more sort of pushing of the boundaries with regard to gore and blood and guts and all those types of things in the 60s. And then even with regard to storytelling, thinking about Alfred Hitchcock. So moving into the 70s and the early 1980s, we see a surge of films that are focused on, one, sort of like demonic children, and two, just the occult in general. And so to this day, the scariest film I have ever seen, and I refuse to watch alone or in the dark, is the original Exorcist. To this day, I just cannot. That is, to me, the scariest film I have ever seen. But we have The Exorcist in the 70s. We have Rosemary's Baby, The Omen, also the film Carrie, based on Stephen King's story. And so in the 70s, again, and going into the early 80s, there are a lot of films that really focus on these like supernatural forces or sort of cult-like forces. So demonic possession, witchcraft, things like that, telekinesis. And think about what was going on in America at that time. So as I mentioned, in the 60s, you sort of had this counterculture, free love movement. And anytime we see the pendulum swing culturally, you can bet that it's going to swing back the other way with full force. And so I would argue there was this sort of response to the free love movement in that you better turn back to religion or else, you know what I'm saying? Thinking about all the films that we had that were focused on demonic possession. And again, kids just running wild. Kids running wild and just doing whatever the hell. So I would argue there was this sort of response to all of the counterculture in the 60s. In 1971, we had Richard Nixon declare drugs as public enemy number one after all these people were smoking all this weed. You know what I'm saying? In the 60s. No, drugs are public enemy number one. And we still have people who are historically excluded, people who are othered, fighting for their civil rights. And so, again, thinking about how that correlates with what we see in horror. And we're going to talk a little bit later about, again, how we value difference. Nonetheless, I'm excited because we're getting to my favorite genre of horror. The rise of slasher gore happened near the end of the 1970s and up through the 1980s. And again, this is where I live. These are my peoples. And I would argue it's because Jason Voorhees is the reason that I love horror now. But whatever, we can talk later about what that says about me. That slasher gore is my favorite genre of horror. Nonetheless, late 70s going into the 80s. What's going on in America in the 80s besides hairspray, bright colors? The 80s seemed like they was a real fun time. Everybody was just so bright all the time. And let me tell you, I was here. Spandex, I'm here for it, okay? A lot of that stuff is coming back, and I'm here for it. Nonetheless, Ronald Reagan was the president during the 80s, and he sort of had this message of returning to family values, basically returning to sort of like Leave It to Beaver Land. And again, I would argue, is in direct response to a lot of the countercultural movements that we were seeing. But yeah, Ronald Reagan wasn't about that life. Nope. We're returning to wholesome, I don't even like that word, but wholesome values. And I feel like the horror that we saw at that time was a big sort of FU almost to that. And again, we can talk a little bit about what those films, what slasher films teach us, right? Like, if you have sex, if you smoke weed, if you do whatever, if you're black, you're going to get murdered, like whatever. And I think the fact that these films were made in this sort of era where that wasn't what, again, people in power were calling for, I think is very interesting. And so some of the OGs in the slasher genre, of course, Halloween, the original Halloween, which I don't know how many films they got now, but the original is still one of the GOAT horror movies. Nightmare on Elm Street, which, again, I'm not as much of a fan of, but that's a conversation for a different day. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and then coming into the 90s, we have franchises like Scream, and I Know What You Did Last Summer, and, of course, the OG slasher, my fave, Jason Voorhees of the Friday the 13th franchise. And I'm going to take a pause for the cause because I can and talk a little bit about my man's Jason Voorhees. I may or may not have a tattoo of Jason Voorhees. I absolutely do because he's my guy. And I'm going to tell you a little bit why he's my guy. So first and foremost, let me give you a background, okay, of Jason Voorhees. Number one, he just had all kind of problems from the womb, okay? Major health problems as a child. Like, led to some physical differences. His head was real big. He had some sort of intellectual challenges, so he wasn't sort of on par with his peers. And because of this, and because of, his mother's own issues, because his dad left, she isolated him. His mother isolated him from everybody except her. When he was around kids, because his mom was a cook at this camp, the kids were mean to him because, kids are cruel. They bullied him. He was neglected by all the other adults in his life, except his mom. And because of this neglect, Jason drowned in Crystal Lake. And that in itself is just tragic, right? It's just a tragic story. So by some, supernatural force, he wasn't really dead. So, spoiler alert, if you've never seen the original Friday the 13th, he's actually not the killer in the original movie. It's his mom. And in the sort of ultimate, the last scene in that movie, when his mom is fighting the final girl, Jason witnesses his mother being decapitated. Now, do I know that for sure? Absolutely not. Am I assuming that he was somewhere around and saw his mother get got? Yes, I absolutely do. So, to recap, Jason's backstory, right? Born with all these issues, doesn't really fit in with anybody else. The only person who loves him and cares about him and talks to him is his mom. So that is his person. He drowns in a lake, and then he sees the only person in his life who has ever loved him get murdered. Now, if that is not a traumatic backstory, I just don't know what is. And the other thing that I'll say about Jason is he don't mess with people until they come mess with him. Like, if you would just leave him be, if you would just stay off his land, if you would just go on somewhere and leave him be, you wouldn't get got. And so for me, Jason is kind of like, again, he has a traumatic backstory. He's absolutely a survivor of trauma, and he just want to be left alone to do what he got to do. But all these people keep coming, trying to open up this camp, what have you. They get got. So nonetheless, there Friday the 13th is a whole franchise that has 12 films, one of which is a reboot. We can talk about that some other time. There's fan fiction, there are graphic novels, there's video games. Jason is a pop culture icon. And again, one of my most favorites because he is not trying to assimilate to this dominant culture. Jason is out here trying to live in the woods, eat squirrels, and live his best life. And everybody just keep messing with him. So I digressed from our larger conversation, but that is my 2-minute plus profile of Jason Voorhees and why he is the GOAT slasher and why he is amazing. So moving on, from the slasher genre, which again, late 1970s all the way up through the early 90s, and I would argue still today, is a popular genre of horror. More recent horror, and I'm just going to kind of lump all of this together because let me tell you all something. Full disclosure, some of this new age horror, like I just can't, I can't get with it. I'm trying really hard, but some of it I just can't. Maybe it's me aging, maybe whatever, but some of it, I don't know. So when we think about more recent horror, like, beginning in the year 2000 and beyond, we see a number of different sort of genres, a number of different tropes, if you will. One of which is commonly referred to as torture porn. So really just like the grossest thing you could possibly think of. I'm thinking of Saw. I'm thinking of Hostel. Films like that where the gore is just ratcheted up to some very extreme level. And what I think is interesting about that is I think that there is a new age of horror fan that is their thing. That is their jam. Even though, like I grew up with Jason Voorhees, but the gore that we saw in Friday the 13th and Halloween and Nightmare on Elm Street, it ain't nothing like what we see in, again, films like Saw, films like Hostel. I'm thinking of Terrifier, films like that where it's just like beyond gross. So that's torture porn. We also have the emergence of found footage films, starting with the Blair Witch Project, up through the Paranormal Activity franchise and movies like VHS, things like that. And to me, there's something very, very creepy about found footage films. I think it's the way they're shot. I think it's because there's something that seems more real about it, because it's like, damn, like that looks like my house, whatever. So we have found footage. We have, again, another sort of, I don't want to call it a resurgence of films that have to do with supernatural forces. So films like The Ring, The Conjuring franchise, Sinister, Insidious, things like that, where this is some next level stuff that we dealing with right now, and typically you need some sort of like divine intervention or otherworldly intervention to help you conquer whatever it is that you're dealing with. We also are in the age where everyone and their mother is rebooting every classic horror film of ever. So we've seen, again, reboots of Friday the 13th, meh. Nightmare on Elm Street, absolute trash. It, meh. Poltergeist, things like that. Again, movies that have become sort of cult favorites are being remade, which I guess that's cool. And then we have whatever the F A24, that movie studio, is doing. I have no idea what it is they're doing. Like, every time I watch an A24 film, I feel like I gotta take notes. And I don't know if we want to call this like elevated horror, but like just yesterday I watched Midsummer for the first time, and I just what? Like, I mean, I get it, but I don't know. So A24 is like in a sort of league of their own in terms of what it is that they're doing. Again, some people call it like elevated horror because it definitely has a sort of like intellectual piece to it, what have you. And then the last thing I'll say sort of about what I think is interesting about horror, and I wouldn't necessarily say that this is new, But I think the world has been particularly horrifying for the past few years. And I think that creators and artists are using the genre of horror to really underscore how frightening the world is for some people, and I'm thinking of things like Lovecraft Country. That series is amazing and uses horror to really underscore the violence and brutality of, discrimination, racism, things like that. And so I think that the world is frightening. One thing that I think horror can do, unlike other genres, is to really highlight those things in a very creative, uncomfortable way. And so that is a brief overview of the sort of past 90-ish years of American horror, fly by Cliff's Notes version, like we didn't read the book, we just read the summary type of things. And so what I want to sort of move into now is talking a little bit about, as I referenced before, what is it that we are taught from films like this? How do we in turn learn what is to be feared based on horror films? Because again, that's what the people who create horror films sort of at a base level are arguably playing on our fears. And so how does that sort of correlate or align with sort of larger societal fears, things like that? So borrowing again from Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue, and again, I got this from the documentary because I watched the documentary. I have not yet read the book, but the documentary talked about 3 different tropes that really lend themselves to creating horror films and lend themselves to evoking fear responses. And the 3 tropes that they described are 1, the unfamiliar, 2, a lack of control, and 3, a lack of information. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about each of those, and I want to start with talking about the unfamiliar. One of the first things that we're taught, that I was taught, let me not say we, everybody doesn't have the same experiences, but in schools, one of the first things that is taught when we're learning about social skills and all those different things is stranger danger. It's perchance one of the first things that you're taught growing up by your family is if someone or something is unfamiliar, like we approach it cautiously. Stranger danger. And thinking about people with historically excluded or marginalized identities, stranger danger takes on a whole different lens when you think about the danger being very real just because of who you are, how you identify. So I think about, LGBTQ plus children. I think about children with disabilities. I think about children of color. I think about, children of, parents who may be undocumented, what have you. For some kids and for some families, when you're taught about stranger danger, it has a different sort of element to it, right? But nonetheless, we are taught from a very early age, stranger danger, unfamiliar equals dangerous. And so I think another thing that is unintentionally reinforced with horror films, but which again I think is not something that's new, is when we see a physical othering or a physical difference, that too is something to be feared because that is unfamiliar. So you think about these slashers who look physically different. I'm thinking about, again, Jason. He's like 12 feet tall, whatever. He's like huge, right? You think about Jason, you think about Frankenstein, you think about Leatherface. People who clearly, physically look very different than what we may be familiar with or what we may expect. I think about, again, I referenced it earlier, American Horror Story Freak Show or the 1933 film Freaks. Again, physical differences, unfamiliar, which in turn we have been taught equals dangerous. In addition to sort of physical othering, oftentimes people who have physical differences are socially isolated. So in addition to looking different, you often engage in different ways. And again, I'm thinking very much about Frankenstein, who had zero social skills. And so the combination of looking different, looking scary, quote unquote, and then not having any sort of social skill, like it's just a whole recipe for disaster, which again, in the ways that we were taught, equals scary. And then I think about those elements of horror that, yes, absolutely have physical characteristics that are different, but that are not, like, you weren't born that way, so to speak. So I think about like the zombies that we see in The Walking Dead, or really any zombie anywhere. That was once a person that's now all decayed and gross. I think about Freddy Krueger, who was once a regular person and now he all burnt up. I think about Michael Myers, who we don't know what his face looked like because he always got that mask on. You know what I'm saying? There are things that I think creators do in horror films, and, you know, to evoke a fear response that create a visible mark of difference. Zombies look all gross and decaying, like Michael Myers wears a mask. Freddy is all burnt up, because we, again, have been socialized and taught that physical difference, a visible othering, is to be feared. And let me just say, first and foremost, that is not something that I ascribe to. That is not something that I think that is not something that I will affirm. This, I think, is a good time to talk a little bit about the difference between validation and affirmation. I can validate that that is a belief that folks have. That doesn't mean that I affirm it and say that that belief is correct. And so what I'm talking about is sort of a validation of beliefs, not an affirmation. So I do not affirm that just because someone looks different, that they are to be feared, or just because if someone looks different, they are dangerous. I absolutely understand how and why people have those beliefs, though. And so moving on to thinking about other than physical differences, how are villains, for lack of a better word, in horror movies, what is it that really evokes fear? And I want to talk a little bit about and I'm going to use this term loosely, psychotic villains that we see in horror. I'm thinking about the Norman Bates. I'm thinking about the Patrick Batemans. People who, quote unquote, look regular, but got some whole other stuff going on underneath of that. And so thinking of those three tropes we talked about earlier, the unfamiliar, lack of control, lack of information. I'm thinking about Saw too, right? Like the people who were in these situations and Saw, like, I want to play a game. All of those different things, right? Those people had there was a guise of control. I think that, you know, if you just do this thing, you won't die. I feel like had no control over being put in that situation. So that is horrifying. There's a lack of information about how and why I got here and why is this happening. Even though Jigsaw gives this whole like backstory, that still doesn't tell, like, why is this happening? I think thinking about, you know, like Patrick Bateman in American Psycho, like, sir, you're at the top of the societal hierarchy. You are a white, cisgendered, heterosexual man who got money. Like, why are you doing this, sir? You know, things like that. Again, lack of control, lack of information. Horrifying, right? The other thing that I think is unique about people who don't have physical sort of differences but are very scary is you could be sitting next to Jeffrey Dahmer on a bus and not even know. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's this sort of proximity that is also very frightening. I live just west of Milwaukee where, you know, Jeffrey Dahmer killed all those people in the 80s. And there is, even though he's dead and that happened a long time ago, like, thinking about that, there is something that is very frightening. If I was sitting next to Jason Voorhees, I would know it because he looks different. If I was sitting next to Michael Myers, I would know it because he looks different. I would not necessarily know that about Jeffrey Dahmer or Patrick Bateman or any of these other people, right? So there's this issue of proximity, again, that is also quite frightening. And again, I just want to reiterate the difference between validation and affirmation. That, again, I understand how and why people would have these beliefs, which does not necessarily mean that I agree with them. And I think that talking about people who, like, again, the Norman Bateses, the Patrick Batemans, people who seem to have some sort of mental situation going on, which is causing them to do what it is that they do. I think that unintentionally, films that include villains, killers, whatever you want to say, like this unintentionally perpetuate stigma related to mental health. So thinking a little bit about stigma, people with a mental health concern are more often than not perceived to be in control of that, and as such perceived to be responsible for it. So, oh, you're depressed? That's your fault. You should get up and do this. Oh, you're anxious? That's your fault. Again, these are not things that I believe. This is what stigma is having this believe this idea that if someone is depressed, if someone is anxious, if someone is whatever, that they're responsible for that. So they then need to do something to change it. And so people tend to respond angrily to people who have mental health concerns because, again, there's this idea that if you are that way, you can do something about it. And if you're not doing something about it, then it's your fault. And so I think that, again, movies about these sort of psychotic, again, I use that term loosely, people, particularly, again, I'm thinking about Leatherface, right? Like, he was just a regular old dude who did all this stuff. Like, you think about his whole family. Like, these weren't supernatural forces. These were just people. To use Sam Winchester's phrase, these are just people, right? There is something that perpetuates this idea that people who have mental illness are to be feared. People who have mental illness, if they're acting out because of that mental illness, it's their own fault, et cetera, et cetera. And so, again, thinking about how these characters in horror films, these different tropes, condition us and teach us what it is that we should fear. And so with that, we are going to bring this conversation to a close. And so American horror, about that. And so, compliment sandwich style, I'll start with something good about horror, which obviously you have heard me say I love. Love, 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 love. My favorite thing about watching scary movies is laughing after the fact. Like, literally, I will be watching a movie with my husband who never gets scared of anything. I will be sitting, blanket up to my chin, watching the movie through my fingers, and so tense, so scared. Like, I can feel my shoulders just tensing up. And there's something so fun about coming out on the other side of that. So one of my favorite things about horror is literally laughing at myself for being scared. Like, and again, not laughing at myself in a demeaning way, but it's like this roller coaster of emotions that you go on. Like, the suspense is building, the tension is building, and something happens. And then afterwards, we're just laughing, and it's funny. And so that is one of my most favorite things about the genre of horror. Something not so good, so this sort of middle layer of my compliment sandwich here, it has been more difficult for me to watch horror movies of late. And some of that may just be, me getting older. And, I used to be able to watch people getting, chopped up, whatever. And it's like, what? This doesn't faze me. So some of it I think is that. It's just, maybe I'm getting more prudish in my old age. But what I would say is that it has definitely been difficult. It has been difficult for me to separate like fictional horror from the horrors of every day in the world. And I think some of that has come with my own maturation and the way that I have grown into my own as a professional and the type of work that I do, and really understanding inequities and what that's like for people and their lived experiences. And so it's hard for me to watch a movie about scary stuff when I feel like the world is so scary for so many people. You know what I'm saying? And I think that I have to, and I am beginning to, I've very recently returned to watching more horror movies. Because again, it's something that I really, really enjoy, and I think I've had to really set myself up to watch them, right? Like, this is an escape from all of that other stuff that you do. Like, this thing that you're about to watch, this is fictional, this is that, and I'm using this to sort of cope, for lack of a better word, because I understand that this is fake. And there are a lot of other horrifying things that I deal with every day that are not. And so I think that has been something for me that has been rather difficult. And then sort of the last thing I'll say to put the bottom bun on this compliment sandwich is that horror is absolutely amazing. And I think that, again, in speaking of my maturation, when I was younger, watching scary movies was about it. Some of it was about the gore. Some of it was about, you know, jump scares and loud sounds and all those different things. And I think now I've really grown to appreciate the messaging. I think that, again, horror is unlike any other genre in that, people are coming in and they're expecting to be scared. They're expecting all of these different things. And the beauty in which some of these creators get messages across in this very, I think, difficult, very tense type of way is absolutely amazing. And I think that now there are definitely horror movies, because I always hear people say, like, I don't like to be scared. Like, everything scares me. Everything scared me too. Like, I'm still scared of the dark. Like, I will admit that loudly and proudly, right? I think that there are so many different types of scary movies now. There's so many different, Netflix got like 500 different shows, like whatever. There's so many different platforms, so many different ways that people are exploring this genre that I really do think if you have an interest in getting into it or, what have you, there is a way. And I absolutely would recommend that you do that, because it is definitely, it's tight. It's tight up in here. Okay. And with that, I want to thank you all for your time, your attention, and for bearing with me and my nasally voice. Hopefully the next time that we are together, this is all cleared up, because I'm just about sick of it. Pun intended. So until next time, good people, I wish you and your families safety, health, and joy. Be well, y'all.